I never thought much about where my values came from, and I didn't think they were much in doubt. And so we tend to try to explain most of the apparent value changes in history as our learning new facts, not that our values have actually changed. It's really quite shocking to realize that, in fact, these values are just actually pretty arbitrary. They're generated by this pretty random process. And once you realize, well, these values aren't just like proxies for facts summarized, they're just actually values. That's just shocking, because it means this thing we rely on more than anything else, in some sense, that we trust more than anything else, is just not trustworthy.
Welcome everyone to Moral Mayhem. Today, Vaish and I are very excited to be joined by Robin Hanson, one of our favorite GMU bros, to talk more about his concerns and ideas around cultural drift. Most of you have probably heard of Robin already, but Robin is an economist at George Mason University. He's the author of the popular blog Overcoming Bias and co-hosts, along with Agnes Callard, the podcast Minds Almost Meeting, and is just generally a very prolific and unique thinker. So Robin, thanks so much for joining us today. I forgot to say, especially I haven't read The Age of M yet, but I would love to. But The Elephant in the Brain is one of both Vaish and my favorite books. But yeah, Robin, thanks so much for joining us. We were thinking that since we already talked a little bit about the ideas, we just step back for a second and talk a little bit more about culture and what we mean by adaptiveness. So I'll give a stab at it and then you can respond. So if culture is sort of a set of norms and values which incentivize cooperation among group members, present and future, then adaptiveness is determined by the degree to which this set of norms and values enables members of the culture to grow in number over time and in a manner which is robust to a wide variety of potential environments. Does that sound roughly right? Or like, do you have any notes on how you think of adaptiveness?
So adaptiveness is just another name for, say, fitness, which is just another name for predicts it will survive and grow. So, natural selection is just the observation there's a selection effect. And the key process is selection effect. And you're trying to pick an intermediate level of abstraction to say, well, succeeding and growing in the long run is caused by something more local, but we're not going to specify it too carefully. Just there's some somewhat local tendency that causes you to survive and grow, and we're just going to name that and call it adaptiveness. So it gives it a flexibility, but also a lack of precision. But it's very
Right.
common in biology and in cultural evolution studies to talk about adaptiveness. I'm perfectly happy with the concept.
But when we talk about it with respect to culture, it might be worth clarifying at what level are we specifying the adaptiveness. So it's the specific culture, however you draw boundaries around it, and the ability for it to survive in the long run,
I mean, the usual approach in biology is just to focus on, say, organisms or even particular strips of DNA, say. In that context, the adaptiveness of a strip of DNA is its tendency in the long run to survive and grow. The adaptiveness in organisms is the tendency of their descendants to survive and grow. And then adaptiveness of any larger units would inherit some adaptiveness of their parts, right? A culture, a nation is adaptive if its members will survive and grow, right? Or many of them, averaged over different parts of it. So I don't think we actually need to distinguish the units so much per se. Although the other part I would say, you asked, like, a culture is the sort of norms and coordination parts. So from cultural evolution point of view, everything we do is culture. That is, everything that we pass on to each other is culture. And then I'm happy to accept that, but I want to make a distinction between the parts of culture that it's relatively easy to vary individually and locally, and then the parts that are coordination points across large groups. And that's what you might mean by norms and status markers and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the first observation is that in the last few centuries, we've had much less selection pressure on individuals and these larger units. And we've had less variety, but it's mostly at this larger coordination unit level. that is at the level of, say, particular technologies or business techniques, we still have wonderful and laudable levels of selection pressure and variety. And, the world is growing gangbusters on those things. So many people, when they hear you say, the world's having problems, they say, but look at these trends. Isn't this great? And you want to say, yes, those things are great. But there is this other level at which we could have problems at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's basically these coordination points. And so, yes, and so we have this word where we talk about a culture. In some sense, that's a package of people and things that share a bunch of these coordination points.
Mm-hmm.
They share norms, they share status markers. And of course, that's often because they share geography and contact and, intermarriage and all those other things. But for our purposes here, that we say the selection pressure is going to be on these shared pieces. And that's the thing we have problems. So I do like to make the analogy with species, because I think that helps people see it. In ordinary DNA evolution, there's evolution within a species. And then for that, we want a few big species, because then the innovations can spread as far as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's innovation of the features that define a species, and those can't vary within a species. And if we're going to get evolution of those, we need to have many species, i.e. many small ones. And in fact, in biological history, it seems like places that had fragmented ecosystems, i.e. fragmented places for species, had many small ones, and we actually descend more from those. More of the world today descends from places with fragmented ecosystems, because apparently the evolution of features that species share matters more than the evolution of features within the species. And so the analog for culture would be, even though we've got fantastic evolution of technology and business practices, say, that are allowed to vary within our cultures, that may matter less in the long run than the evolution of the features that are hard to share within cultures. And the evolution of that has gone way down for three reasons. Again, less variety, because we have emerged many peasant cultures into nation states, then nation states into a global monoculture. That's reason one. Reason two, less selection pressure, because of less famine, war, pandemics, all the things that used to squash and kill them. And then third, there's sort of the internal drift rate. Used to be peasant cultures were really quite conservative and didn't like to change very much. That hindered their technology and business practice evolution, but it helped with their cultural evolution. And in the last few centuries, we've switched and come to celebrate cultural activists who eagerly change our norms and status markers without obviously being directed by selection pressures there. So then those are the three reasons then we would have plausibly worse evolution of the features that cultures share.
A comment that I think Regan and I got on the previous episode in terms of the premise of reduced selection pressure, right? So you talked about how things like war and famine, we just know how to, we've become better at avoiding preventable causes of death. And that knowledge is spread far and wide, even if the culture that first developed them was a different culture, right? So every culture has access to that. And someone pointed out that, well, if there was a famine, it didn't mean that like Irish culture died out. The Irish still survived. And I think we probably need to distinguish between cultures adapting, the continuity of cultures versus continuity of an ethnic group or something like that. Because the culture might have died out that actually led to the famine, but then those people, the remnants of that population, adopted a different culture. Does that make sense to you?
Right. So I think if you think of Ireland as a culture, you're kind of missing the point in part. That is, if you go back 3 or 4 centuries, and then for all of human history before that, Ireland was hundreds of cultures. It wasn't one culture.
Right.
Each local group of people, roughly 1,000 or so people, was kind of a separate culture. And they've often had different cultures, different languages, and different customs, and different lots of things. And then a famine or war could well wipe out that 1,000 people, or at least wipe them out enough that the remainders sort of split and absorbed into neighboring cultures, and the unique features of that culture was lost.
Yeah, and also we carrying on with the evolution example, it's like you could think of, let's say on a shorter time scale, a contiguous group of people could adopt new norms because they were forced to due to environmental conditions, which is sort of like the species developing into a new species, but
Right.
in the
Speciation.
same line, but different enough that it really does count as like a new species, new culture.
Right. I mean, they could break off a subspecies. We often call those cults. And so one of the issues here is how much to be enamored of cults once you see this new view. But then cultures were also just changing a lot in the way that, so the usual concept of speciation for biology is that small groups get split off and then they have rapid change in their features, which eventually makes them unable to make the others, i.e. small isolated groups are more prone to rapid change. So the same would be true for small cultural groups.
Right. So just stepping back for 1 second, so you highlighted sort of the intracultural selection versus the intercultural selection, and that as we have, produced all this great technological development and abundance, we've reduced the barriers due to distance, essentially. And so ideas or new norms or new values, which are sort of like mutations, can spread throughout a much larger population because of interconnectedness. And therefore, the intracultural selection pressures have become relatively more important than the intercultural selection pressures. And the intercultural selection pressures made sure that when intracultural selection took on a bunch of maladaptive norms or values or what have you, that those cultures didn't do as well relative to others because there was, they would be dominated or they would just grow less quickly and whatever. And so as we've produced all this abundance, which has allowed this homogenization of culture and the spread of good ideas, it's also allowed the spread of bad ideas more quickly. And it's reduced sort of the guardrails, preventing the global cultural groups from going totally off the rails.
I would rephrase it as saying the price of having a much wider scope for sharing technology and business innovations and a division of labor with a global market is that we've shared more things at the global level. We have more global norms that we allow less local deviation from it. And I could go through a number of examples for those if that's not obvious, but I think we basically do have more of a global monoculture, especially among elites. And that means whatever the global monoculture chooses, that's just not going to be disciplined much by selection because the conformity pressures are strong enough just to mean that everybody has to do the global thing, no matter how good or bad it is.
Would you agree with the characterization that whatever we call the global culture, I mean, you could call it sort of some offshoot of Western liberalism or something. Isn't that just the culture from the perspective of history, just the culture that won out and was able to spread far and wide? But then the question is, what is the metric on which it won out and what was it trying to optimize for? And I guess when Regan and I discussed this, the answer to us was, well, material abundance, right? So the whole point of, like, I guess, Western liberalism and free market capitalism was aligning self-interest of the individual versus with that of the collective to produce what? My answer would be material abundance, but I wanted to know if you had a different lens through which you view this.
There's just the more fundamental selection pressure of like dying or going away or not. And then in a world that has sort of status competition and other coordination mechanisms, there's a competition to win in those coordination mechanisms. So, but that's at risk for if we have the wrong status markers, then we induce maladaptive competition, and whoever wins it isn't necessarily doing us all a favor, but they're winning on whatever the competition is. So it is true that cultures and nations, et cetera, have competed for status and dominance, and they compete not on just fundamental existence, because existence hasn't mostly been threatened, but they have competed on various status measures, including wealth, certainly being one of them. And so that's induced nations to copy the cultural practices of other places that were higher status. And so competition for status is definitely part of what's driven this convergence. And yes, you could certainly say that the winning practices were the ones that were better at achieving the shared status markers. And that's, and if those status markers are good, then that's all great, good competition. But there is the risk if we have the wrong status markers, then you have not such great competition. And that's why status markers are one of the key things to worry about in cultural evolution. Do you have good markers?
And I think that tying these two things together, this is why it's potentially sort of inevitable that we end up with this homogenization of, like, if a culture is successful enough at dominating others or convincing others to adopt its values voluntarily, so we can think of this as like cultural
Right.
colonialism or cultural evangelism. Either way, if it's successful at both of those, if it's successful enough, you'll end up in this homogenized scenario where culture drift can happen, and then I guess eventually that can lead to new smaller cultural groups winning out again, but with probably a lot of backward moving
Right.
stuff in between.
Right. So, I mean, a context we probably share is, I guess, the most plausibly predictable long-term scenario here is that the mainline culture continues to drift and decline, and that these few now small, insular, fertile religious subcultures like the Amish or Haredim have been doubling every 20 years, continue to double every 20 years for another few centuries, and then come to dominate. And that they will be less adaptive in terms of less command of technology and other things, but win overall primarily through fertility.
Right.
And
And
that's, a sad outcome we might hope to prevent, but at least then it's not human extinction that's at risk here. And possibly they will, in a few centuries later, revive technology and revive growth and maybe go on to the stars, or maybe have another cycle of cultural drift and collapse. And what we'd like to do is find a way to avoid that.
yeah, and I think one of the core tensions here is that when a culture is very good at creating technologies that enable abundance and ability to do something or even think about something like colonizing Mars, the practices and norms which enable cultures to do that make it more adaptive in a certain way, but it also makes it sort of like you're just betting everything on one big culture, and a lot of people are in the same
Right.
boat.
One conclusion I drew is that if you all you care about is sort of the survival of the human race, then it depends what type of extinction risks we think are the most plausible, and does the mitigant to them flow through maximizing economic growth such that we figure out how to solve the problem, or is it something like, well, actually, if anything, the global monoculture that maximizes abundance in fact leads to creating those specific anthropogenic existential.
So I had one sort of mental image came to mind. I just want to share it, and then I want to go back and answer your question or address it in some detail. But the image that came to my mind was, I realized I've often been in these very creative communities. I was in long ago, there was a group called Xanadu, and there were science fiction fans near it, and they sort of invented the World Wide Web, but did a bad job of trying to implement it. And then more lately, I've been around rationalists and other people. And so I've learned that there are these world of very creative people, and by the metric of coming up with interesting ideas, they're at the max. But if you want to make a business that builds on these ideas, what you want to do is hang around them, find the best ideas, grab it, and then take it elsewhere and have another group of people implement it, because those people aren't good at implementing things because they're too creative and they have to like add creativity to everything. And so there's a sense in which that's kind of the future where the Amish and Haredim rise. Much of what we've created will be inherited by them. They will throw many things away, but then the main way we would have long-term influence is because they grab those things. So that just seemed an interesting analog to me, right? Where there are other cases where, there's a different place that generates ideas and innovation, and then another place that is best for applying and making that last. Okay, so I looked to, your podcast is called Moral Mayhem here, and I listened to your last episode, and you guys were very focused on moral reasoning and moral argument. And so I want to sort of explicitly flag this issue of, I worry about getting too sucked into that, because there's a sense in which once you like start arguing about morals, like everything gets pushed aside and that's all you do for a long time. But I admit that those issues are central here. But my intellectual style has long been trying to sort of find a way to be robust with respect to difficult issues that you want to sort of bracket and set aside and see how far can we get if we don't deal with those issues. That's kind of how I feel about morals here. I want to say, how far can we get without deciding which different moral views are correct or which ones we even want to embrace? And I certainly think if the scenario is like the collapse of civilization, a specific number of alternatives, there's a lot of other dimensions of moral reasoning we don't have to invoke there because the options are just so stark. And I feel like just this basic analysis is such a dramatic implication and source that there's a lot of disputes that are just not going to be very directly relevant. And so you can productively set them aside. And so I guess one way I'd like to make the pitch is that anything you want to do in the long run requires the prerequisite of survival and even growth to do it. And in fact, that constraint is the stronger the farther into the long run you look. So in the very short run, we each have a bank account and we've got free time, and in the next day or two we can do pretty much anything we want if we decide to. But if you talk about the next generation, well, now we have to organize our lives differently if we want the next generation to be influenced by us, and then more generations in the future. I think the more constrained what you have to do becomes if you want to actually win in that long run, so that you can promote anything else you care about. So that's, I guess, my pitch. But if you push back and say, well, why should I care about the next generation? I'm going to go, okay, I don't know that you should. But
Yeah,
I think that just enough people do that we can just have this productive conversation among the people who would care about having long-term influence. Whatever long-term influence you want to have, you realize you'll need to do that through something in the future that descends from you. And the farther in the future you want that to be, the more you'll need to attend to that constraint. And so this analysis is really just attending to the constraint that you can't assume survival and growth. That is actually quite challenging.
Yeah, I was just gonna say on that topic, which is like one of the things I was talking about in the last podcast was, if we're thinking about this rational culture agent idea, which is you're not too tied to your, somebody who cared about creating adaptive cultures and pursuing long-term growth of human civilization in some on whatever time frame, has to care about cultural adaptiveness. But I think that just like with a lot of other things, the actual values people hold are often sort of like proxy values, which were culturally selected for because they promoted
Right.
adaptiveness, right? And so I think everybody, and to your kind of going back to the deep multiculturalism, shallow multiculturalism thing, if we think of it as like deep multiculturalism is you allow people to differ on sacred values, and shallow multiculturalism is people can only differ on non-sacred norms and values, then I think everybody sort of is willing to adjust the non-sacred norms and values to serve their sacred norms and values, but they may not be aware that the sacred norms and values they hold are actually proxies for something else that were selected through some other thing. Because the way that values actually gain strength in terms of directing what you do with your time is that you think they're true, not that you think they're these proxy values. So anyway, I'm not sure where to go from that, but
face this analysis, and then maybe we could change your mind.
Right.
But yes, that's how people start out. So, I mean, I have to say that I'm really quite shocked that at this old age in my life, I have such a radical change in point of view. But the way to channel it for our listeners and viewers is that, I think I and everybody else typically assume that, okay, here I am. I, of course, have my values, but my values are obviously reasonable values. Why wouldn't I have these values? Everybody around me does. And then we all sort of have institutions and mechanisms to collect information and technology for ways to achieve our values through technology and institutions and coordination. And then, history is our layout of our trying different ways to coordinate and achieve the values that we can agree to share over the long run. But I never thought much about where my values came from, and I didn't think they were much in doubt because I kind of assumed they were just obvious. So I might think of, say, today we're more against racism, and they might say, well, of course, they were wrong about racism in the past, and that's not a value thing. That's just a factual thing. They just misunderstood the nature of, who is how productive, or correlation of genes and activity or things like that. And so we tend to try to explain most of the apparent value changes in history as our learning new facts and being more informed, or even about sort of fundamental moral conflicts and issues not that our values have actually changed, because that is hard to understand. And certainly we don't think that our values change during our lifetime. Even if other people in other cultures have this strange phenomenon that they had different values, that's not so relevant for us because we are at least constant in our life. So it's really quite shocking to realize that, in fact, these values are just actually pretty arbitrary. They're generated by this pretty random process. And that random process causes change, not just, across millennia, but across generations and within my lifetime. And that within my lifetime, I can see big changes in values. And I look at the process that's just sort of random contests where people win out to gain status relative to the usual status markers. And then they're allowed to make changes to the values. And then we just accept those. And then that calls your attention to these values. And once you realize, well, these values aren't just like proxies for facts summarized, they're just actually values. And they are changing rapidly. And they are changing by a pretty random process. That's just shocking, because it means this thing we rely on more than anything else, in some sense, that we trust more than anything else, is just not trustworthy. But then you might have thought, well, okay, everybody else in history did this. I guess I could too. How wrong could it be to just do what everybody else in history has done and trust their culture's values? And then you see, oh, well, your values are a lot less trustworthy than theirs were, because here you're in this unusual history where exactly the theory predicts that yours are less trustworthy. And then especially all these changes in the last century or so, those changes are especially untrustworthy. And then you go, but how am I supposed to question that? How do I go back? What do I do?
But so let me try to attempt one pushback from the perspective of a cultural insider, if you will, right? So one thing I would say is, well, Robin, you seem to be taking the view of a cultural rationalist, but your inherent preferences, and I know Regan talked about this, and I'm sure she'll talk about it more. Your preferences are actually, that of a long-termist or someone that cares about the long-run future. But in terms of what the current system, our current culture that we all consider ourselves a part of, if you ask the question of, what that's optimized towards, people would say, it's internalized the locus of like control and morality to the individual, and that's why it's successful, because it sort of like helps people access well-being for themselves and tries to align that with broader social goals. But then you could ask, okay, well, that's all fine, but that seems maladaptive from this like biological fertility perspective, long-run fertility. And then maybe the person would say, but the beautiful thing about material abundance is its fungibility, right? So when you accumulate capital, you're also saving it for the future. So why couldn't we, just as we use technology to solve other problems we've created along the way, why is fertility a problem that you feel particularly pessimistic about? Why isn't your solution to, dismiss all the cultural stuff and talk about, well, let's just push the pedal to the floor on economic growth and try to make sure we can have artificial wombs and all these other things where we would increase the reversibility of any trajectory change we have.
So I was just describing my shock at this revision to my worldview, but I think the most straightforward response is then to say, okay, I can't trust so much changes lately, but maybe I could trust some average over cultures all through history and space and time, and then maybe sort of downweight recent changes, but otherwise that's my best guess, is some sort of average. And then if I could reason further about which cultural elements are more likely to contribute to survival, then I could adjust that in light of that to the extent I want to prioritize survival. And then once we see this problem, the natural thing to ask is, what are possible fixes and what can we do? And you've just been talking about one of them that I mentioned, which is this idea of deep multiculturalism. Could we, even in our highly connected, high trade world, somehow create more cultural variety and more selection pressures, therefore? And that's a big ask, as you've noted. But it's at least one coherent concept to consider. I have a list of half dozen of them I'm happy to go through, but one of the others is let capitalism rip. So, I mean, you might say the problem with capitalism isn't so much that we have all these strong selection pressures in business and technology, is that we have whole areas of our life that we won't let it touch. We don't let it, basically, for example, for fertility, if you would just let capitalist orphanages create and own kids and sell them, they would make them, there'd be plenty of kids. That would solve fertility. We're just not willing to do that. Okay. There is a, more modest capital solution I think would work for fertility, and we could discuss that. But fertility is more the sign of a deeper problem. Although I'm happy to, support the more limited capital solution, fertility. But again, I was spending 8 months thinking about fertility, and then I switched to culture exactly because I saw, oh, there's a deeper problem here, and even if we fix fertility, we aren't fixing this other problem, and that's why I've been focused on it. But I do think we should fix fertility, even if it doesn't solve cultural drift. And the recommendation solution I would have is to endow parents with right to transferable shares in their kids' future tax payments. And then, so in your transcript from last time, you were talking about, are we willing to pay for more kids? And maybe we aren't. And I'd say, well, this is self-funding. Nobody has to pay anything. We just give parents the share in future kids' tax payments. Nobody loses anything. And that funds the kids. And it's a win-win for everybody today. So, that's a capitalist solution. And it doesn't require that the capitalists own orphanages where they sell the kids, because that would be ordinary parents. But I do think it's going to be hard to get people to actually adopt this win-win solution. And I think culture is part of why.
I wanted to touch on the deep multiculturalism topic again, just for a moment, just to say that, we have some amount of deep multiculturalism because, like you said, we do have, communities, Amish communities, Haredi communities in cultures that are part of the global monoculture, which we kind of allow to do their thing within some bounds. We don't allow, polygamy, and we try to prevent child marriage, and there's still some limits there. But we allow some amount of deep multiculturalism where they really do have different core values than the population they're in. But what I was saying, yes, last time was like the deep multiculturalism seems inherently unstable because unless everyone has deep multiculturalism as one of the values within each of the cultures that are deeply multiculturally together, then any of the cultures that doesn't have that value, it seems like cultures tend to want to spread and dominate and imperialize others. And I think this goes back to the values question, which is you were talking about, values being adaptive or not, but people also think just like, are my values true? Whether they're adaptive or not, they think like this is a core based truth. And so if you believe that your values are true in this core way, either that they're serving God or that they're serving individuals or whatever, unless you don't care at all about everyone outside of your group, you're going to want to convince them with force or with evangelism to join your group. And so it just seems like it's very hard to see how it could sustain itself.
So if we're doing economic analysis and the question is the degree of centralization or merging of different units, we should think in terms of both centralizing forces that cause the units to become larger, but also decentralizing forces that cause them to become smaller, and look at the trade-off between them. So, for example, Marx and Engels apparently a long time ago thought it was obvious that capitalism would eventually lead to one big firm in the entire world controlling everything. And, even today, people with AI risks seem to think AI is going to just naturally cause one big AI to control everything. And there are just often these analyses that seem to suggest that things will just keep merging, and you're offering such an analysis here. You say, well, there is this force by which you would try to conquer other cultures and make them become yours, and there is that force, but there are also forces in the other direction. And so that's why you might imagine an equilibrium where the forces are balanced. So even today, the same with nations, each nation would like to conquer the world and make the world serve it, but of course the different nations resist that. And even when people try to create centralized units like the United Nations, many people are wary of giving it much power for fear that the other people will use it to take over them. So that's why we might hope that you could have a world where, yes, each culture does think it should conquer all the rest and force them to its will, but there's an equilibrium where none of them trust each other enough to allow them to get close to that. And that's why they have a balance of power where there is variety.
And so in what important way would that paradigm look different from, the world we live in today?
Right. So, for example, in the world today, every nation but one prohibits organ sales. The one deviation is Iran.
Yeah.
And bioethicists are getting together all the time saying, how are we going to make Iran conform to global norms about organ sales? They're doing it wrong. We're all doing it right. So you can imagine a world where that had different norms there, that it was more okay if different nations did it different, because that's how it was up until a century ago. And this is true in many kinds of regulatory areas at the moment, that it's just this norms that if anybody's deviating from what most nations are doing, they're just doing it wrong. You certainly saw that at the beginning of COVID. There's just these strong social pressures globally to pressure deviant nations to conform to what everybody else is doing. And that's the opposite of what we need here. But certainly in the past, we've had worlds where nations and communities were eager to distinguish themselves and have a justification why they should rule and why they were better. And part of that was because of why they were different. That was a reason why they did not want to all conform to the same average behavior. So the question is, could we move back to what we had up until a century or so ago in terms of international norms, where we aren't trying to force everybody to be the same? I would certainly say the example of Christianity and the religious wars is certainly an example in your direction, But there was this fact that we had these really fierce religious wars culminating with the 30 Years' War. And then people looked at the carnage and said, okay, enough. And then they embraced a norm of let's just let different places have different religions and let that be okay. And you can see how these things just vary across time. So then we could just maybe hope that it could vary in the other direction in the future. But that's kind of a faint hope, I'll agree.
I like the religion example because this kind of gets to one of the things I think I was trying to say is if your culture has universalist values, you will want to dominate other cultures more than if you don't. So you kind of need to see the outgroup as an outgroup in order to not want to dominate them. And the religion one's interesting because at one point it was, we're trying to save everyone's souls or whatever, or we're trying to glorify our God or whichever direction that goes in. And then when sort of liberal individualistic norms and values became more core to our culture, they were basically adapted as more core even than the religious values. So then we said, okay, that's no longer a sacred value. People can differ on religion if they're in my outgroup, but they can't, genocide parts of their population. Then we'll intervene in that country. Or, there's still some limits where we
Right, but
don't
I think you
allow
have the
certain behavior.
causal direction wrong there. That is, they didn't first say, okay, downgrade religions, upgrade civil society, then now let's be peaceful. That's not how it happened in terms of the causal order. They were very religious. They were eagerly religious. And then they killed a third of the population. And then they went, let's just slow down a bit. And they didn't directly change their priority on religion at that point. But the net effect of their practices over centuries had that effect. But the direct effect was just to go, stop. Maybe
So
God doesn't want this.
That's sort of the pain resulting from those things became a proximate enough feedback mechanism that it caused what could be called an adaptive change or it caused this change in values, whether it's adaptive or maladaptive.
Right. Well, so just like genocide and carnage was part of their status markers, they felt ashamed a bit of what they had done, and that pressured them to change some behavior, but they weren't initially thinking less of God or religion per se.
One piece of this that's slightly unclear to me is to the extent to which some of the ways in which the monoculture spreads itself is rational versus just a instinct for expansionist culture, in the sense that take the example of the propensity to find positive sum kind of trade-based solutions rather than use violence, right? Or the norm against kind of initiating violence or being the aggressor in kind of the geopolitical stage. That's not just a cultural preference, that's sort of that truly does solve some sort of like prisoner's dilemma amongst nations. Now, I think it's possible to conflate the norms we want there with what individual populations can do within them. So maybe we're conflating like some types of liberalism with the idea that we should enforce certain like liberal world order norms at the level of nation states. But then I think, well, can those things be easily sort of decoupled in that don't the values that percolate within societies influence what they do as nation states? And in kind of a globalized world, how pragmatic is it to not try to have them also play the nice version of tit for tat, if that makes sense?
So in this last few centuries, we have this dramatic change from hundreds of thousands of peasant cultures to maybe hundreds of nation cultures to a global monoculture. And the process there involved a substantial amount of selection. That is, we didn't randomly pick the global monoculture. It was imprinted much more by the more successful nations. And then even within a nation, the national culture wasn't a random amalgam of peasant cultures. It was also picking the most successful cultures. And so there were substantial selection effects during that merging process. But then once everything's merged, that selection process would only go on if you had some sort of way in which different parts were experimenting at different things. And then the center looked at the different things and said, oh, that looks best, and then imposed it on everybody else. And then there may well be things like that, but it doesn't look like that's what most changes are. So it does look like the global monoculture is making big changes that aren't mostly the results of watching local experiments and comparing to other places and saying, that looks better, let's copy it everywhere. I mean, there are some things like that in technology, certainly, but that doesn't seem to be the main thing. But we have to admit that many changes in the last few centuries could well be adaptive changes. The theory just predicts that there should be this maladaptive component that you should worry about of the things that are hard to vary locally, but it's less clear. Some things are somewhat hard to vary locally, but still maybe very locally enough to have produced selection, and that we should be glad for those changes.
I think and I think the organ donation example, or sorry, the compensated organ donation example is a good example where no one's looking at the one outlier doing compensated organ donation and saying, oh, that looks interesting. They
That
don't
seems
have
to work there. Let's copy it, right?
Yeah, like that's not. Instead, what we're seeing is like, if you think of like NATO or the EU as a way of disciplining through non-forceful incentives, smaller subcultures to get closer to the monoculture. Like we've moved away from sort of explicitly colonizing other cultures, but we have continued to incentivize them to move closer and closer towards the core set of values that
Which sounds a lot like colonizing to me, but fine, we've changed the name.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as part of the same imperialist way of thinking.
Yeah,
It's
of course.
just
We go
carrot
to you,
versus
we're
stick,
better than
right?
you should copy us. I mean, that happens when we go there and take over. It also happens when we influence you from a distance. It's still the same thing.
Right. It's just the carrot versus stick sort of approach. But I think, some of it is voluntary adoption where people look at capitalist countries and the abundance that they've created and the quality of life that people have and think that is something worth copying. But I guess part of that is also, like you said, wanting to be high status and other things. So I guess one question is, how do you see China? Is this a different culture, or are they part of the global monoculture in your view?
I think the US and European media is eager to find aspects of China that are different from them, especially ones they can disapprove of, because there's really just a strong desire to paint China in the review of the West. And there are some things that are different there, but mostly they aren't that different. They are a very westernized culture and business practices and their, marriage habits and just all sorts of things. They are really pretty much the same. So I've known people, for example, in say genetic engineering who for a while had hopes for China because they said, oh, sure, the West won't allow this, but China will be different. They'll allow stuff. And then China didn't. And there's been a number of those things where China didn't actually deviate as much as many Westerners had hoped because people were hoping for variety and they pinned their hopes on China for be the variety. And China has only willing to have a limited degree of variety. China does crave respect from the rest of the world. A lot of things they do is to earn that respect.
So I want to discuss the idea of what does the presence of an outgroup do to the adaptiveness of a culture, right? So, like, is it actually adaptive for Westerners to see China or some other placeholder as external and a culture they're competing with? Because at least then it induces some form of artificial selection pressure like thinking that causes people to think about the long run. I mean, it's at least one plausible hypothesis for sort of like fertility in Israel, for example, right? But that's, yeah.
Well, one way to think about it is just how much variety is in it. So for even on fertility, the whole world is moving in the same direction, but there is variance. There are places that differ. And you have to ask, well, is that difference enough to save us? And the same you should ask about, Russia and China are both a bit deviant from the global median in some ways, and there are some other dimensions of variation, but is it going to be enough? Because I think the cultural drift standard has sort of an absolute standard of enough. Will this, basically, does the society in effect grow or decline relative to these competing alternatives? And I certainly agree that the more variety, the better, but it could well be just not enough variety. So another, example is even with the United States, we have left versus right as a big cultural divide. So that's a kind of variation, but it just doesn't, by itself, it's just not enough, I would say. It's not zero variation, but I think you just really need a lot more variation than that. So a standard I would give is Mormons. You might have said, well, look, are Mormons different enough? And you say, look at all these differences. They've got a lot of differences. And a century or so ago, they had some pretty strong insular fertile subcultures. But then the Mormon church made a conscious decision to integrate Mormons into the country to reduce the conflict that they had seen a century ago. And they succeeded at that. And now Mormon fertility is about 20 years behind the rest of the country, but on the same trajectory. And I might say that's not enough. So I would give the overall metaphor as if your ship is heading to an iceberg, you either need to turn the whole ship or you need to get off on an iceberg. And the standard for the ship is, does it not hit the iceberg? I mean, you could have some influence on the ship and turn it a little, but it just might not be enough. Right? And so you need to say, well, how much variety and selection pressure is enough really to prevent civilization collapse, basically.
And then cults are like groups of people jumping off the ship in the lifeboat before they hit the iceberg and trying to go in another way or something.
Right. Now, most small cults fail, but, I guess if you wanted to try to lean into multiculturalism, one of the ways to do it is to try to celebrate cults. Because we now kind of look down on them, but you could elevate their status and say, because in fact, with species, it turns out there are particular features of the DNA replication system that promote speciation. It turns out that the mating subsystem of the DNA just has a higher mutation rate, and that allows species to break off more easily. And so you might think analogously, cultural evolution should have special features that promote speciation, i.e. new cultures. And that would be some sort of special indulgence of cultural cults, which are descendant cultures. But again, it's a big ask.
And just to hammer home the shallow versus deep multiculturalism, which I think we talked about last time, but I think it's a helpful concept here because, obviously Western liberal cultures tend to say that they really value multiculturalism, but to your point, that multiculturalism is in the sort of external, less sacred values rather than in the core set of sacred values. And with, even with our subgroups that exist in America and stuff, we do have some limits that they're not allowed to go beyond, like I mentioned with like the FLDS that split off, right, and then got busted and had all this stuff going on.
So I feel like we've mentioned 3 of the kind of solutions I've considered.
Oh yeah, let's go through the rest.
We've spent a lot of time on deep multiculturalism. 2 other things we mentioned is just let capitalism go wild. Like let it own babies and kids, but also maybe even own countries and nations, like let it manage everything. And then I think the innate strong selection pressures in capitalism would solve the cultural drift problem. But many people just hate that scenario. Third scenario we described somewhat abstractly is just this idea that could we sort of reason through what a new set of values would be that would in fact be survival values consistent with the fact that we are changing by natural selection. And then if we can do that at an abstract enough level, then that doesn't need to change anymore. We could just have a stable set of values, which are explicitly in terms of wanting to survive and have descendants, and then, make various social norm status choices as instrumental strategies to achieve that, and be willing to change them if people show us evidence that they aren't achieving that as well. And that would be another sort of approach. It's a really big ask because, as you know, there aren't that many people who are that rational, and even rationalists don't like this. So that's just a really big ask. But I'm actually, it does seem like the sort of thing I could at least think through as an intellectual. It's an intellectual project to work on. I could try to figure out how that could work. And that's at least a thing I could do. But some of these other things I can't do that much about exactly. So I'm somewhat tempted there. Another solution is reaching human level AI before the fall of our civilization. And I estimate that we have roughly 70 years worth more of progress had we continued our steady exponential growth before we run out of innovation in this cycle of civilization. So that's the deadline. But if we can have human level AI or brain emulations, which is the subject of my third book, then they are naturally competitive in the sense that AI or EMS are in a world where they can grow the population substantially faster than they can grow wealth. And that means they would naturally fall to subsistence level incomes and therefore have relatively strong competition and therefore plausibly fixed cultural drift. Now, it's not obvious because they could also just have enormous cultural pressure to everybody do everything the same, even if they're all at subsistence level. But I see more hope there, at least for that. But that does require that these AIs or Ms be allowed to evolve their own culture. And a lot of AI safety people are set against that. Their whole point is we shouldn't allow AI to get very powerful until we can figure out a way to enslave them, basically, or to make sure that they would not deviate in their cultures from our culture, which then would not solve cultural drift. But if you think, I do think there's a substantial chance of this. I'm not sure it's more than 50-50, but a substantial chance of human level AI in the next 70 years worth of, equivalent worth of technological progress. So then it requires that we not only achieve that level, but also free the AIs sufficiently for them to, explore the space of cultures through their selection pressures.
Right. And I think that the reason we want to constrain them is, again, because we don't just think our values are our values. We think they're literally true in some sense. And that
right. But that's an obstacle to any fix to cultural drift.
Yes.
Right?
No, and that's why, people, like, even when it comes to gene editing, right? Like, this is also why people are nervous about gene editing, I think, because, I think your viewpoint seems to be, I would love to have some impact on the future, whether it's through reproduction or ideas.
Not just love to, I insist on it. That is, I put a high priority on that because that's a necessary ingredient for any other influence I want to have in the long distance. I need it to survive. So.
But then I think other people want to they don't care if it survives unless they're similar enough to it. And so unless they can control the way things develop, then they don't see the benefit of having an influence or something.
Imagine you had some tiny chance of becoming world emperor. Okay. Or you could have the usual influence we each do over the world. You might say, well, I only care about the world if I can be emperor. If I can have this huge influence, well, then I care. But if I'm only 1 in 8 billion, well, who cares? I don't want to have any influence. And that's, I guess, kind of arrogant, really. But you could imagine that sort of a threshold thing. I don't want any influence unless it can be a lot. I think that's roughly what you're saying about the future. I'm saying I got to accept having a pretty small influence on the future because there's this huge constraint of survival. But I'm determined to do the best I can with that small influence. And then I'm happy to talk about which way I would push it and what the issues are. But I see that I just have a small influence. So there's
Mhm.
this huge constraint I have to take into account. I think that's analogous to saying I'm only 1 in 8 billion people. I'm going to try to make a better world, but I mostly can move the world a little bit, right? Not make it vastly different. And if you say, well, unless I can make it vastly different, I just don't care. And I'm going to say, no, I do care. I want to take my small influence and do the best I can with it.
Yeah, the reason this came into my mind was I was listening to somebody on a podcast and they were talking about gene editing and just eugenics and selection for intelligence in particular, and what that could do for culture and technology. And anyway, one person was like, I know that means future generations could be much more different from us than we are from previous generations, but that's just the way things are going. And so I'm just all in on it. And the other person was like, I think if we got everyone up to a 120 IQ and then we just stopped there, that would be ideal. Right. And it's like
Right.
the intuition that you can't let them go more than the 120 IQ average, or it's too different from who we are to care about them. If you take the evolutionary view, you can create a narrative in which you're connected to everybody past and present, no matter how different they are from you, simply from the causal influence you're having, versus sort of like wanting to feel community and caring about the future because you feel like you could hang out with those future people or something. I don't know. So I think those are just sort of two different intuitions, maybe.
You could just pick different thresholds for how similar you need to be to them for you to care about them.
Right.
And how direct the influence needs to be. But I'm willing to accept pretty small amounts because I figure, look, I'm just one person in 8 billion and one generation out of thousands, and I shouldn't expect to have a huge influence. But so
Nor
in the
should you
world,
expect to be similar to the people that you do influence.
right? Well, I mean, I expect to be as similar to the future people as I am to past people, but I'm not that similar to past people. So why would I expect to be similar to future people? But some people, so in the world of AI, for a while, I think there was a whole contingent of people who, and maybe they still are there really, who basically said, look, humanity now has a chance in the near future to sort of have a world government that takes over all of civilization and controls evolution. Evolution will no longer decide what happens. Humanity's going to take control, and then it's going to be the AI who takes control. But if we take control of it, then we're still controlling. They think there's, and not only a substantial chance, but they think all the other scenarios are worthless.
Mm-hmm.
The only scenario they see of substantial value is where somehow we take over the world and we prevent any change we don't like. And now the future has value to us because we only have the changes we approve of. But the default world where changes keep happening out of control, they think that's just worthless. A generation or two out, who cares? None of that's worthless because they're all just so different and they weren't what we chose. And I think that's pretty unlikely that we're up to the task of taking control in that way. And I think even if we did, it would go pretty wrong. And I'm just willing to accept the degree of similarity between myself and my descendants as similar to my ancestors, and I think that's okay.
And obviously, like I guess in the scenario where AI does some future planning and sort of because there's two ways out of this, right? One is you imbue people with a culture or objective function that's kind of abstract, as you said, so it adapts to the goals and it's in relation to new environments and goals, so it's not a set in stone cultural value. And the other way we would accomplish it is if we could somehow get the selection pressures going again and diversity going again. So, but at the level of sort of like which values are plausibly, good at spreading themselves, I have an intuition that getting people to care about the long run does run into these issues where people have different sort of expectations and solidarity to what they want to feel connected to when you go like a few generations out. So maybe the solution is, well, we can only get people to care about their, maybe one generation out and their families. And then the alignment between that and the long term, we have to leave to AI or some other mechanism. But the idea that we could convince a critical mass of people to have a similar objective function for the very long run, I don't know, strikes me as less plausible.
Well, let me then describe one of my other solutions that exactly requires that. So I'm the inventor of this form of governance called Futarchy, and it's a form of governance where you specify the outcome you want by some sort of metric, and then I claim that it would actually be very effective at achieving that metric, i.e. doing what it takes to make that metric higher. So it's based on betting markets, and we don't need to go into it now, but let's assume that we have access to such a governance mechanism. Then my proposal is that we have a governance mechanism tied to a metric. Part of the metric would be all the usual sort of comfort and convenience and health and respect, et cetera, measures. But we're going to put a big weight on a new novel thing, and that'll be a sacred goal that we together have decided we want to achieve over a longer run. So a concrete example would be the date we get to the stars. And the metric is the sooner we get to the stars, the better. There's a definition of enough probes have to get to enough stars and land there and reproduce and survive for a while to be success. But the idea is, if we're willing to see that as a sacred goal, then we need a goal like that that's inconsistent with civilization collapse. You see, that's the key point. But that can't be the main reason we pick it. We have to actually feel this as a sacred goal and feel the energy and respect and awe of it. If we're willing to do that, then when speculators figure out policies that would make that more likely, those policies will cause us pain. It will not be what we would have just done otherwise for other purposes. And then usually if policies are causing you pain, you say, get rid of that and let's do something else. But if you're suffering pain in the service of your sacred goal, then people are often proud and more devoted to the goal. They want to show that they are suffering for the sacred goal. And so then people might let this continue. Instead of canceling it, they would just let us hold on to this long-term goal of the date we get to the stars and be unified around the fact that we are a community suffering costs for this long-term goal. And then if that continues, then we actually prevent civilization collapse. And then basically we do whatever else it takes to solve cultural drift, because that's what it takes to not collapse and get to the stars. And now we are a group of people who have a long-term thing that we have agreed we want and that we are devoted to, and that's the thing that saves us. So, I'm suggesting it for the purpose of the indirect effect of then we don't have collapse, but I think it has to emotionally actually be, a compelling goal. I did some surveys about what else could sit in this slot if you want to ask, but basically that's another solution I think could work.
One of the things that we had talked about last time or on Twitter, I can't remember, was the degree to which cultures are selected for implicitly valuing future people significantly enough that you try to avoid collapse. And so the idea was that when there was a lot of intercultural selection, that was kind of baked in anyway. Whereas when you take off those guardrails, you should expect more proximate incentives to matter more. And then I think about like Elon Musk or, Simone and Malcolm Collins is kind of trying to do what you're saying, where they're trying to create in different ways a narrative that people can buy into that is energizing and trying to sort of make a transcendental goal of like getting humans to the stars and like viewing future people as these, they do it in different ways, but
Right.
kind of similarly trying to create cultish narratives that people can buy into.
Well, it's not a cult if we all do it. It's
Right.
only initially a cult when a small group of people want to do it. Well, when it's all of us doing it, now it's culture, not a cult, right?
I don't know if it's easy. I mean, I think that on the one hand, people want to buy into meta narratives about why they're here and what they're doing. And we are thin on those right now. So it seems plausible to me that this could be one thing. And people are energized by, Elon Musk. And this is his thing, right? Is trying to get people excited about the importance of us eventually colonizing other planets. And anyway.
He's certainly using it to energize his investors and his engineers and customers. So
Right.
That's at least something.
And like there's an interesting tension here, which is you could distinguish what is the actual long-term, or not what is the actual, but if you were being completely empirically minded to the extent that you can and just focusing on your epistemics, what would you think is the biggest like long-term threat? So maybe you go the way of EAs and rationalists and say it's AI safety or something else. But that answer can look quite different from the thing we need to say is the long-term priority to energize people, because I think doomerism is less sort of energizing than the Elon Musk
Right, absolutely.
vision, even if it's more robust, even if the other one has more, I don't actually know which is more important, but in terms of long-term survival, but it seems like truth is orthogonal to
No, but I think, again, well, I think, basic fact is you have many goals, and there are many ways to see each goal as a sub-goal of the others. And you just really have a lot of freedom with respect to which you pick as your most fundamental goal, because pretty much any of them will require that you pursue the others as well. And so here, then, we want to pick a goal that most inspires and energizes, as long as it, in fact, tends to induce you to do the other goals too. So any kind of doomerism would also be an obstacle to getting to the stars, you see. So, a system that says, let's get to the stars as soon as possible would also be looking out for dooms and trying to prevent them. So that wouldn't be especially neglected there. But I think we can't be that motivated or inspired by just preventing doom. That's not really going to work to have us be willing to sacrifice. It needs to be something that seems transcendent to us.
And
Higher
you're
than us. We are coming together to be something larger than we are.
and solving any X risk up to that point is just an instrumental goal now to achieving the final goal of going to the stars, something like that.
Which, in my mind, is just the instrumental goal to prevent collapse. But the point is, it needs to be credibly in people's emotions the goal that they have accepted. And that's
like the goal of getting to the stars will keep us focused on adaptiveness for long enough for like the future people can figure out when that starts to lead to cultural drift, they can figure that out again.
Once we get to the stars, okay, we'll need a new thing, but but maybe by then we'll have fixed the problem.
What do you think? Do you see like, states' rights sort of as a way, as like a very light version of trying to encourage deep multiculturalism? And like, the US was sort of set up with that structure.
Right.
And then you can see how the monoculture pushes against that and doesn't like that states have, like, abortion, obviously. People don't, that is a sacred value for both sides of the aisle.
There's a book by a man named Stuntz, who was a Harvard law professor, and he wrote the book, published it just before he died, about the history of law in the United States. And his story is basically that the initial law in the United States was really quite, decentralized in the sense it gave every location strong freedoms to just have different law. But then over the centuries, a series of moral crises induced the Supreme Court to make rulings that limited the deviation, because they wanted to make sure we didn't deviate on key things like slavery and prostitution and polygamy and in drugs and a whole bunch of things. And then by now, we don't have much states' rights because of that sequence of moral crusades. And so these moral crusades are sort of the glue that causes us not to be so different. So, and then therefore, if you want to produce deep multiculturalism, you kind of have to create a culture that wants to break those and basically say that when we have a moral crusade, we don't have to go force that on the world or the whole country. But that is a big ask.
Yeah, and the way we do it, I mean, the people who are impassioned by that tend to make the argument from a liberty perspective and allowing people to choose to have different values, which is another way of getting at the same value, but still encodes some sacred values that must be shared. Like, if most people who are even pro much more states' rights aren't pro allowing states to have slavery, for example. Right? Like that's not in
some
the
libertarians are, but most libertarians aren't. I agree. So one solution that you touched on a bit on your last episode that we haven't mentioned today, we should just talk, is the return concept. That is, it is true that, say, cultures from 1800 were adaptive relative to their, or 1700, say, compared to their competitors at the time. So then you might think, well, we just went back to one of those cultures. Would that be a way to solve cultural drift? And, as you mentioned last time, a big part of the problem is that these cultures were embedded in a lot of context. And in order to go back to them, you'd have to bring back a lot of that context, would be throwing away a lot of technologies we treasure. And so then the challenge would really be more to abstract a version of that old culture, to detach it from the technology and social specifics, to be, something like 21st century version of 17th century England culture, or whatever that could be, which is actually a challenging concept to even figure out. And so once you've gone to that degree of abstraction, I'm not sure it's that much better than just trying to pick this, abstract survival values, but it deserves to be listed as another thing. And then there is a version of this for every culture from 1700 or from wherever back. You say, could we somehow go back to a functioning culture and abstract from that details the specific context so that we can have a modern version of that culture that then inherits the survival value of that culture, but isn't so arbitrarily tied to the specifics. And that's a project somebody might want to, embark on to try to figure that out. I'm not that optimistic, but I'm not that optimistic about any of these solutions. That's the point. So I just think we should explore them all.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the return thing is kind of interesting because it is more diversity than I think we had a few decades ago in the mainstream discourse, where conservative was still sort of like conservative progressive, moving at a slow pace, protecting what we've built so far. And then there was like the radical progressive, where it's like, no, we need to rip down systems and put new systems in, and then everybody in between that. And now I think of like the return people are a new thing that's not progressive at all, or that's
It's not
more like,
conservative in the sense that they don't want to go back to 1950
right.
or 1980. I don't know what time conservatives now want to go back to. I've lost track.
Before we wrap up the segment on this, I wanted to ask, like, because I know that you're making a generalized point about cultural drift, but the most salient example that probably catalyzed this was fertility, as you said. Yeah, can you give us a couple of other, or maybe just one other thing that might be that's maybe a
Maladaptive.
problem now,
That it might be drifting.
Yeah, that might be drifting.
Okay. Well, it does seem like we're doing worse on mental health. And it's actually surprising that, if you have subsistence agricultural communities, they have very low rates of mental health. Now, some people think that's low rates of diagnosis, but as far as I can tell, in fact, they do actually have very low rates of mental illness problems. And we seem to be getting worse on those things. Certainly, since World War II, we've seen these tendencies of not only increase in inequality, but increase in polarization. We had these trends before World War I, actually, and they were sort of reversed by the World War Wars. And so then we have this problem that unless we have another big world war, these things are probably just going to keep getting worse. And certainly part of that is also a thing is a sort of declining patriotism or militarism. Now that's ambiguous, I think. The question is, so the world has had less militarism and less war, which all looks great if it's in equilibrium. But the worry is, like, if it's actually not safe against a perturbation where some group decides to be very warlike, then we're not very adaptive. We're just lucky that we haven't seen that perturbation lately. And that's a question that, say, Russia is exploring at the moment. And so I'm not sure there. But you could plausibly think we've just lost our patriotism and militarism habits that would be essential if we did have a period of more war. But that's not clear, but that's at least plausible. That, there's a bunch of these trends that contribute to fertility that also just seem to have other problems as well. So it does seem like, I guess in the last few decades, there's a lot of sort of failure to launch of young people. And so, and part of that is just extended educational trajectories, which seems dysfunctional. I mean, I actually would say increasing medical spending as a percentage of the economy and increasing educational spending are both dysfunctional trends. Similarly, just increasing expense and complexity of law. Law is just less accessible. Like two centuries or so ago, the typical English person sued somebody once a year. And that's because the courts were very cheap and easy. They didn't need a lawyer. And we have since just allowed law to get a lot more complicated and expensive and hard to use. And part of that is the world's more complicated, but it's not actually most of it, I think. It's that we've just allowed it to get complicated. So I've discussed and passed the idea of rot. And so I think rot is a thing that's happening in some institutions the longer they stay around. And so the US has one of the oldest governments. And so we should expect to see the longest expanse of rot in terms of institutions decaying. I also have like some theories of where to predict drift to go. So one theory of drift is just random walk. Is a good place and it randomly walks away. But there's other theories that are more predictable of the form. There was a pressure in a bad direction that was held back by selection. When selection was released, those trajectories were realized. So one of those is just this intuition that we're naturally lazy and selfish, and that, as you said before, one of the functions of culture is to make us pay attention to other people and pay attention to the future. But when culture decays, then we just do that less. So we are less future oriented and less other oriented. And so there'd just be a decay. And basically we'd be getting lazy and selfish over time. And that describes some cultural trends. And then I have this forager to farmer to forager story, which is that humans as foragers had certain cultural patterns. And then when farming became possible 10,000 years ago, roughly, it was only possible because we had enough cultural plasticity to change our norms and values in the direction that supported farming, which was quite different. Farming norms and practices were quite different from foraging. And so farmers had a lot more inequality, stability, a lot more trade, a lot more war, a lot more hierarchy, a lot less travel, a lot less variety, more hours a week. Just a lot of changes happened in farming, and many people have said it was just, per person, a terrible thing for humans to do. Even though we had a lot more humans, individual human lives got worse. And then in the last few hundred years, as we've gotten rich, my simple theory is we're drifting back more to forager styles as the cultural pressures that made us into farmers are relaxed. And so that plausibly explains trends toward democracy, less religion, more travel, more leisure, lower fertility, more variety, all of which are, in fact, differences between foragers and farmers. And then we can see many of those trends as caused by this. Now, but from a subjective point of view, you might say, well, this feels great. Well,
Yeah.
promiscuity is another one that is actually.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up the poly anger.
Yes, exactly. So
I think a lot of
foragers are a lot more
people.
promiscuous than farmers, and we have become more promiscuous over recent decades. And that's predicted by this returning to forager style.
Yeah.
And this explains why, because I see, I don't personally have an issue with people who want to do their relationship however they want, of course. But it's well, of course. See, I'm already signaling my cultural affiliations.
Right.
But, it's I see poly people tweeting. It's crazy to me that people get so angry at people honestly communicating and making norms that work for them, blah, blah, blah. And I think where they're coming from is they're like, hey, the monogamy thing is just a proxy for stable families, for helping create stable families. And we're doing that. And so we don't need the proxy anymore. I mean, the certain ones of them. And then everybody else, but they're like, why is everybody getting angry? And everyone else is like, because poly is already super, super tempting. And that's why we punish people a lot when they express it openly and talk about it.
It's not clear that they are, in fact, more stable.
Oh, no,
statistics I know about people their lives are, in fact, less stable.
Right.
So the fear is being realized in a pretty literal sense.
But it's that maybe you don't get the better argument is that it's some inversion of luxury beliefs where it's like, yeah, our lives are less stable, but we have the cognitive and material capacity to handle that flux. But if those ideas were to spread far and wide, maybe you couldn't say that they would.
Well, I mean, the key idea of this farmer to forager transition would be, say, 300 years ago, a young farming woman, she might have the inclination to be promiscuous, but she would see the threat around her, people would say, and she would see that young women who did that had a lot of troubles, and maybe they and their kid died, and she would see very credible threats that if she deviated from farming culture, she would face substantial consequences. And then as we got rich, those consequences look weaker. Young women see other young women around. They have children out of wedlock. They seem to be doing okay. Why couldn't I? And then the threat is just much less compelling. And so the whole idea would be we've drifted toward forager styles because we individually say, that'll go okay for me. It won't be so bad. And I like it. It feels good. I feel like I would enjoy that. And that's why we've made this drift. And
that's also why we're okay with people we want to hear the stories of poly relationships going terribly and, sex workers being facing all these consequences, because we feel like if the average person tries this, it'll go badly. And so we want to make it very obvious what the potential costs of this thing are. And people who talk about it in purely positive terms, we see as obscuring those costs and endangering the youth or whoever it is.
We're pretty selective. That is, we've had a lot of these huge trends toward forager styles over centuries. And for most of them, we've embraced them and said, that's fine. Right? But you could have told that same fear story about any of them. Say
But
the
I feel like
transition to democracy, we could say, the public will vote badly and that'll be bad. We need our elites in charge, right? Or more leisure. You could say if people have more leisure, then we won't get as much stuff done and that will be bad, right? There's just all of the pro, forager trends. You could have a story about why they are dysfunctional. They were dysfunctional in the farming world. That's exactly why we've drifted the other direction.
But do you think that the allowing the forager lifestyle, there is something here about sort of what's good for the median person versus what drives right tail outcomes? So I would argue that in modern capitalist or in the 21st century, maybe most of the wealth is produced by sort of a complete detachment from these norms and exploring the space, exploring sort of a very loose space of norms. And, that's just, we're in a different wealth creation paradigm, and hence we've gotten drift in that direction. And maybe that's maladaptive on the biological level, but it's doing something else in our current society.
I mean, one of the we have a whole history of rationales and justification for the liberal trend, which is largely the pro-forager trend. Certainly one of them is just it's enjoyable. Another is that it cuts down on war and conflict, which of course is good. Another is it promotes innovation, which it does seem to. And so there are a bunch of metrics that's the key problem here. Like there's a whole bunch of metrics on which the world is winning and just a limited number on which we're doing badly. If you're just willing to look away from those limited number of metrics, we're doing fine, right? But unfortunately, it can be that just doing badly on one or two metrics takes everything else down.
Right. And like, I think even if you concede the innovation point, it's unclear whether that is stable in the long run, even leaving aside population concerns, because one of the things that struck me reading your work was at the very core of culture and cooperation is the idea of fighting against the human tendency to discount the future and be selfish, right? Those are two impulses that we're always trying to kind of temper with culture in one way or the other. And there are your theory does predict a lot of things that are happening now that people talk about under very different contexts. So one being just we talked about this in one of our podcasts, the at least ostensible reluctance to punish people that violate social norms in public, for example, right? And yeah,
at least when they're sympathetic. I mean, there are some norms that we're really eager to punish in public, like say sexism or something. But say robbery, then we're more or like reluctant to punish that. Say,
actually playing loud music, in a public space or anything where you're imposing either a small externality on large numbers of people, or even just a fairly large externality, but the subject of the crime or violation seems to be also the subject of our empathy, then we get confused. But it seems like a bunch of those things, if you want to enforce them, they also require you to show some pro-social courage. And it seems like this forager drift does explain some of the other impulses that we have, including, lower propensity for nationalism, militarism, and just, compassion maybe in this instance, especially in the way that it mostly manifests. We are actually more compassionate, but for the vast majority of people, it doesn't cost much to say you're compassionate. And this is, it's probably a feature of kind of the cultural drift system. I don't know if that's true, but it seems like your theory kind of predict that.
So I want to ask you guys. So, I've been pushing this cultural drift story for, 9 or 10 months now. And I can get many people to nod and understand, but I find it hard to get people really engaged or very concerned. Like, it looks to me objectively like, oh shit, civilization has a fatal flaw, and what the hell do we do? And I find it hard to get people to see it at that level of concern. And so I keep searching for different ways to frame it, or different, things to emphasize, or what analogies to make to get somebody to care. And I'm still a bit puzzled why it seems so hard to get. So if you have any reflections on how you came to maybe see this as, okay, this is now legit when you weren't seeing it so much before or something. Help. I'm just trying to like, how do I get, I mean, I'm just one person. This isn't that deep concept. I'm not that original here. So the question is, how can we get other people to be working on helping on this?
So I don't have an answer, but I have an answer to one of the reasons it's hard, which is like going back to the values thing. And in order to be motivated, you have to believe that the thing you're motivated on behalf of is true and important. And for people in our cultural group, that is liberalism and, individual rights and those sorts of things. And I feel like the debate that we've been having in our cultural group is between muscular liberalism and cultural relativism. And it's a big shift because, like, I feel like the people who would be potentially open to these rationalistic arguments are the people who were kind of more leaning on the muscular liberalism side of things. And also the thing that I was saying about concern that if culture changes so much, then why care about the future anyway, I think is part of the reason people might not care. So I think maybe, yeah, I think the narratives tying us to future people are an interesting way of doing that, and in trying to sort of replace the transcendent goals with something that is lined up with adaptability or lined up with adopting adaptive norms, cultural norms. What do you think, Vaish?
Yeah, I actually have I mean, yeah.
And then I'll tell my thing about fertility after. I have a little
Yeah,
personal
I have two
struggle.
types of things that maybe are worth trying. One is just a tactical thing, which is a lot of what you write, and which is kind of why we enjoy reading you as well. But is is at the level of abstract concepts and theories. And I think with this problem in particular, it might be useful to have salient examples that that are currently observable that demonstrate that this phenomenon is happening, right? So that's just one sort of piece of it. But then I think the second piece, which is the more important one, which Reagan alluded to, yeah, I feel like maybe there is no good place to abstractly advocate for this, but there is. If you were to pick your favorite solution and then go with that, I think you might have a better shot, because then you're appealing. Then you can be strategic about which one of the solutions has the best shot of success in terms of convincing the people who I want to build a coalition with. Because I feel like some of those, even just, I'll tell you my personal bias, like the Futarchy idea, I'm much more excited about. The deep multiculturalism idea, I'm sort of petrified I'm terrified of, right? So, yeah.
I think like one of the things, speaking of more proximate or less proximate things that you can see, I think the mental health issues is easier to agitate people around because people can see that. The fertility stuff, we haven't seen the downside yet. I wonder if it'll become a proximate motivation, like source of potential motivation for making culture more adaptive if we see other countries struggling in a real way. But yeah, I think unfortunately with the mental health stuff, the options seem to be like going faster and faster in the monoculture direction, more and more therapy for everybody and all of that, or returning. And I think what you're suggesting is perhaps there's something in between.
Or
But
psychedelics, which I know Robin has interesting thoughts on.
I've not tried and I'm not intending to try, but I'm happy to hear other people's reports. So there's this long history of grumpy old men complaining about the kids getting on their lawn and complaining about recent trends being everyone's going to hell. And, just you would like say hate lately complaining about social media making kids mental health or whatever. And so I feel reluctant to sort of jump into that sort of a pool, or I'm just complaining about how stuff has gone wrong lately. Most people who do that want to pick something to blame that's relatively recently adopted that we could switch. So I'm blaming something deep and long that's not at all easy to switch. But, so I guess I'm a bit wary of being in that pool of the people just complaining about recent trends, but maybe that's the thing I got to do anyway. So Reagan, he said what your favorite solution of the ones we described was. His was. What's yours?
my favorite solution is creating the transcendent narrative. basically the cult solution, different cult versions of trying to get people excited about being connected to the future people and trying to articulate the connection as any sort of influence you have on them rather than based on similarity. And I think that is a shift. I think a lot of people see connection with other groups, like they see connection with their ancestors for sure as somewhat based on the line of things. But like even people who are proud of their heritage, for example, they try to say all the ways in which they're similar to their ancestors. They don't just want to say this building blocks led to here. I mean, I guess kind of like Enlightenment values, people like to think about it as the building blocks, but there's not everybody thinks of it that way. So I think, yeah, I mean, Elon is one example. I mean, I brought up Simone and Malcolm.
I'm not clear which of different alternatives you could be imagining here. The one, the Futarchy one was to imagine a big chunk of the world, say Europe or the US, together picking this sacred goal of the date we get to the stars. And then that sets policy for this large region. Say deep multiculturalism, they imagine that we fragment into lots of little cultures, each of whom has their own vision of what they care about, some of which could be their children in the future, but then they could care about them not just in terms, they could care about them in the ways that people usually do, in the sense of each small fragmented culture could hope that its kids are going to be much like them. But that's not what you're picking here either. So I'm less clear what you're imagining.
Saying like I think, and I'm kind of going off the Collins articulation, my understanding of it, which is like, they don't hope that their descendants will be similar to them. They just hope their descendants will be influential, which is closer to what you're saying about your ideas. And they're thinking of it through the, human line or genetic line somehow.
But so I had this analogy of the ship. You turn the whole ship or you get off on lifeboats. Which of those two do you have in mind here? Are we going to make the entire world culture value their descendant similarity, and then we will all pick policies that will promote fertility, I guess?
Well, their descendants' influence rather than similarity, I think, is the more adaptive goal.
Okay.
But yes, I see it more. I guess what I think is like, to your point around, we don't see the monoculture adopting norms from exploring cultures that often. So it seems like subcultures makes more sense. But these would be subcultures of productive people rather than subcultures of unproductive people. And that's like why I brought up Elon.
So I think the key issue here is insularity. So people like the Collinses, et cetera, I think the key problem with what they have in mind is they imagine a subculture that's really quite well mixed with the majority culture. And I fear that that just can't last. So what the Amish or Haredim have succeeded at doing is making not only a different cultures, but making it very insular. And that's what allows it to sustain a difference. But if you just have, your 5 friends and they have a lot of kids and you guys get together for dinners and then you raise your kids and they go off to college and move to different places, the next generation is just going to be lost in terms of a difference from you if they're that mixed up with the rest of the world. So I'd say if you want any chance of a subculture that isn't the whole world, being the answer, it needs to be a pretty insular subculture. And that's exactly what most of people like you and me who podcast, et cetera, aren't at all interested in.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we're here on a podcast is showing that we are trying to mix in and we like to talk with everybody. We like to read everybody and we would like to be part of this shared world culture, right?
Yeah. And this comes to like with my views around fertility stuff, this brings up my own difficulty with, at the end of the day, I'm not really willing to move on the values I already hold sacred very easily, right? Like I write about fertility and, I try to think about how could we just make it easier for people who already want to have kids, or how can we reduce the costs and blah, blah, blah. And I think in general, the way I approach social issues is let's make the costs and benefits more clear so that people can choose for themselves. But then if they choose, let's not shame them and let's not, because those are all deeper values that would be, harder for me to overcome.
The one thing that seems like an obvious thing, if you just looked at the data very quickly, would be, okay, we should like try to incentivize, not forget forcing, but just incentivizing through shame or rewards, women to have their first child faster, right? So pair up earlier in your 20s and have kids. And I think both Regan and I have and I don't think I at least have a less of an attachment to some of these sacred values in some contexts, but I do have the idea that that change would be pretty net negative for a large proportion of people, given just my sense of what it means to be a 21-year-old. I mean, I feel like if we want to, for example, endorse some of those solutions, then we'd also have to change the social context and how we raise kids and how we ask people to partner up. Like, we can't have the version of monogamous loving relationships in this 21st century. Like, we can't impose those expectations on women and then ask them to pair up in their early 20s, for example. So I don't know if
Yeah,
this is just a
I think
mismatch of values.
I think one way of putting this is like, there's a reason that families were involved in marriages for most of history when people are getting married so young, and that 20-year-olds are just not super well prepared to select life partners on average. And so, but I also don't want to then force them to get partnered with. So it all just comes back to the issue of individual liberty for me.
Let me highlight like a separation of issues here. You're thinking in terms of, here I am in a culture, it has these features, which knobs would I like to turn in which directions to make a better world? And I'm focused on, there's this process that already turns those knobs. And you have to fix that process. Otherwise, you're turning the knobs doesn't fix things. They just get turned back in other directions. So once you realize the whole process here is this cultural process that's suffering cultural drift, you have to ask, how can we fix the drift? Otherwise, you don't fix the problem. Even if you can turn a few knobs locally here, there, in a few directions, then this whole process just sweeps through the knobs and keeps turning them the way they've been turning for centuries.
Right. We should wrap it up, but this has been so interesting and such a great conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. Robin
Thanks for your
writes
time,
at
Robin.
Overcoming Bias. Buy his books, The Age of M's and The Elephant in the Brain, and follow him on Twitter. He's very prolific. So Robin, is there anything I missed?
No, I would just want to thank you guys for taking cultural drift seriously. I'm not as discouraged now because not only do you take the problem seriously, you seem to understand it and even engage relevant solutions.
And now he just is hoping we don't have a one-night stand with cultural drift. So we'll
Maybe,
we'll
or
hope
some
we
other
can
listener, right?
go steady for a little while.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much. And see you all next time.